All right, guys, we're going to continue talking about Nixon's foreign policy. We know Vietnam dominated his early presidency, but eventually we will get out of there. Our draft ended in 1972. We started drawing the troops home fairly quickly. Now, Nixon, if it weren't for all his problems with Watergate later on, he would actually go down in history as a much better president than he does go down in history as. He did a lot for foreign policy. Even back in the 50s, he was an expert at foreign policy. And one of the things he deals with, one of the nations he deals with particularly, is China. Now, China is an interesting story during this time period. The thing that caused us to actually start talking to China was ping pong. Maybe you've seen Forrest Gump and the importance of ping pong to the story of that movie. But there is actually something called ping pong diplomacy. In 1971, the U.S. table tennis team was in Japan. They received an invitation to go visit China. They became the first American sports team to set foot in the Chinese capital since 1949. In 1972, the Chinese team was invited to the U.S., and they did come. Okay. Well, in 1972, we opened relations with Communist China. Nixon actually visited China, and we opened informal relations, and we're going to have increased trade with China from this point on. Now, our economy was a little sluggish in the early 70s, and so the reason we did this was to try and increase trade, but also the Chinese and the Soviets had a falling out, and we're trying to exploit that. China's kind of looking for a big friend, so we step in and try and do that. Nixon tours China, as you can see in these pictures, but my favorite quote of all is Nixon saying, "Wow, this really is a great wall." Such a good quote about him. Very profound, saying that the Great Wall of China is actually a great wall. So we normalize relations with China. It's going to take a little while to get an actual official treaty going, but we start to trade with China. But Nixon's not done there. Now we're going to deal with the Soviets. Now the Soviets, we're looking for something called Detente. It looks like Detente. It's a French word, but it's Detente. Detente is a lessening of tensions. We have a lessening of tensions with the Soviets during the early 70s. That Leonid Brezhnev is the leader, and he seems to be very amicable with sitting down and talking to us. Well, this detente with the Soviet Union and improved relationship with China, this is literally the high point of the Nixon presidency. This is the most successful diplomatic achievement, hands down. But we're not done. Well, Nixon, he travels to Moscow in 1972, and he actually works to negotiate a treaty called SALT I, SALT 1. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Basically, what we're going to do with SALT 1 is we are going to remove our medium-range missiles from West Germany and limit the number of those we're going to have. People thought the Cold War was at its end, that it was over, because now we're actually talking to them. We are working to improve relations, and that's what detente is. Now, also, Kissinger during this time, he's initially our national security advisor, but he ends up being Secretary of State. Kissinger adopts a policy called Realpolitik. Now, it's spelled in German, so it looks kind of funny. But basically what this means is realistic politics. We're not going to stand by a set doctrine like containment anymore. We are going to enter any kind of agreement with any other nation looking out for number one. We're going to take care of ourselves first. Okay? Well, we're going to see that. Now, we do end up with detente. The SALT Treaty had been in the works for a while, I think since 1969, something like that. But basically, we agreed to limit the number of ICBMs and halt the development of anti-missile systems. This was huge. We were actually talking to the Soviets. Now, also in the early 70s, there's a big famine in Russia, and the U.S. steps up and sends aid. We send surplus wheat to the tune of $750 million. This causes our food prices to go up because we are sending in our food across the nation. Now, we were already somewhat in a recession. What happens when food prices go up? Well, people buy less of it, don't they? Well, this brings us up to the 1972 presidential election. We've previously talked about how Nixon used his Southern strategy to delay integration, to delay civil rights implementation, to try to win over those Southern voters who felt abandoned by the Democratic Party. So the election of 1972, it's actually a three-candidate election. Main candidate's Richard Nixon, who's a Republican. The Democratic candidate is George McGovern. And then we have a third-party candidate, the American Independents. You may remember from the election of 1968 that George Wallace ran as an American Independent. Well, he did that again in 1972. The issues are changing in 1972. The economy's not doing as well. We do have new appliances and new types of things going on during the 1970s here, these early 70s, and it's causing the election to be very strained. There's an organization called the Committee to Re-elect the President, nicknamed CREEP, that is doing anything they can to try and discredit any Democratic presidential candidate. Now, George Wallace, he obviously was an anti-civil rights guy. Well, in 1972 in that election, he actually gets shot, and he ends up being paralyzed. The ironic thing about George Wallace is, as time goes on, even though he is paralyzed for the rest of his life, he actually works and becomes a civil rights activist in his home state of Alabama. Now, we've just had a lot going on. Well, 1972, Nixon, he's obsessed with winning, so he allows some things to go on that probably shouldn't go on. But Nixon ends up winning one of the largest majorities in American history in 1972. Like I told you, if it weren't for Watergate, he would be remembered in a very different way and probably be viewed as one of our better presidents. However, it didn't work out that way. Also, hitting just after the election in 1973, we actually have a war breakout between Egypt and Syria attacking Israel. This was in October 1973, and this is known as the Yom Kippur War. Okay? Now, the U.S., we provide aid to Israel that helped turn the tide of the war. The Soviet Union supported the Arab states. Because we supported Israel and not the Arab states, the Arab members of OPEC actually embargo oil against the U.S. OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And it's essentially a cartel. A cartel controls the price of a good. Well, the good in question here is oil. And this cartel cuts us off. Egypt and Syria had attacked on Yom Kippur. That's the Jewish Day of Atonement. They crossed the ceasefire lines from the 6 Days War in 1967. Those regions are captured and under the Israeli control. Well, the result here of this, of the U.S. supporting Israel, is that they quit selling us oil. These Arab nations do. They have an embargo on oil shipments to the U.S. Oil prices quadruple in a couple of months. At the outset of the Arab oil embargo, gas was about 35 cents a gallon. Okay. Well, it went to the price during the height of the oil embargo. The price of gas went up to about $1.89 a gallon. You're like, $1.89 a gallon, is that it? But think about it. It went from 35 cents to $1.89 a gallon. Also, minimum wage at this point was $1.25. So you went from being able to get multiple gallons of gas for that 1 hour of work to having to work 2 hours to get a gallon of gas. So this was a major, major shock to our economy. Increasingly, we're using more and more goods that are made from petroleum. You see the pictures here on the slideshow showing the lines for gas, that kind of thing. Now, one interesting change that is brought about by the oil embargo is the fact that there's a growing demand for smaller cars and more fuel-efficient cars. One of the first most successful import cars is the Honda Civic. But the Honda Civic and also Toyota started to import Corollas and things like that into the U.S. U.S. automakers were slow to react to this. They did not step up and fix this. It's going to be years later that they are going to finally try to fix this. But we do see them make some smaller cars like the Pacer and the Gremlin. Ford makes the Pinto. Chevy makes the Vega. Volkswagen Beetles are very important during this time. Now Nixon, because of the oil embargo, he encourages people to take some energy conservation steps. One, he says, let's lower those thermostats to 68 during the winter. That'll save us some oil. Also, they reduced air travel and highway speed limits. They instituted a national 55-mile-per-hour speed limit in 1972. They licensed more nuclear power plants to help have cleaner energy, and they relaxed environmental regulations. And they approved daylight savings time year-round to try and save energy.